Most gracious God, author of all good things, we humbly beseech thee for the Parliament of Barbados, especially the Senate at this time assembled, that thou wouldest be pleased to direct and prosper all their counsels to the advancement of thy glory, the good of thy church, and the safety, honor, and welfare of all our people. All this we ask in the name of Jesus Christ, our most blessed Lord and Savior. Amen. Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the fellowship of the Holy Ghost be with us all now and forevermore. Amen. Amen.
The Senate is in session.
Messages from Her Excellency the President. Announcements by Your Honour.
First of all, the minutes, in relation to the minutes of our meeting of Wednesday, June 29th, 2022, we're asking that those be deferred. The other announcement, I received a notice of absence from Senator Monique Tate. I'm sorry, also the absence of Senator Patricia Paris, who is overseas. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that these minutes be deferred.
The question is that the minutes of June 29, 2022 be deferred. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Presentation of petitions, presentation of papers.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I am commanded to lay the following reports: the report of the Judicial Council for the year 2019 and the Barbados National Diversity Strategy and Action Plan 2020.
Personal explanations. Motions relating to the business or sitting of the Senate and moved by a minister.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move the suspension of Standing Order 45-2 for the remainder of today's sitting.
The question is that Standing Order 45-2 be suspended for the remainder of today's sitting. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Introduction of bills.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move the first reading of the Safety and Health at Work Amendment Bill 2022.
The question is that the Safety and Health at Work Bill 2022 be read the first time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Public business.
Public business is now the order of the day. Senator Dr. Monroe Knight.
Thank you, Mr. President. The matter before us, as indicated, is the Safety and Health at Work Amendment Bill 2022. Essentially, Mr. President, the amendments that we are considering today are intended to augment the provisions of the Safety and Health at Work CAP 365, which is a 2005 act, which also repealed the Factories Act CAP 347. Mr. President, if you would allow me to be able to read what the main elements of CAP 365 are. The Act makes provision for securing the health, safety, and welfare of persons at work, for protecting other persons against the risk to health and safety in connection with the activities of persons at work, for controlling certain emissions into the environment, to consolidate the law relating to health, safety, and welfare in the workplace, and related matters. Mr. President, I want to suggest to this honourable chamber that this discussion is extremely significant, particularly in the context of today's realities. I believe that in the present environment, there's a large concern in terms of workers' pay, as they should be. But very often, the conversation would suggest that if we increase workers' compensation, that all will be well. That we would have dealt with the fundamental issue affecting workers. This act suggests that there are other critical areas that are also as important to ensuring that workers' rights are fully addressed and taken care of, so that even as we speak to the issues, as we rightly should, in terms of workers' compensation, that the issue of their safety and health is also of equal importance. In fact, Mr. President, studies have shown that indeed addressing the issue of safety and health has significant beneficial correlations to, one, an increase in productivity, and also as well an increase in terms of workers' attitude to their workplace, i.e. workers in a safe environment have more buy-in, will work harder in the context of an environment that is safe. So, Mr. President, these amendments that we will consider today are fundamental to ensuring that there is a full recognition of the gambit of things that need to be in place in order to be able, like I said before, to make sure that we address the workplace environment. I also want to suggest, Mr. President, that the amendments that we are presenting here also speaks to government's ongoing commitment to relook at its legislative framework and to include and make amendments where it is necessary to that legislation. As I said before, the amendments are intended to augment CAP 365, and really it signals, again, government's commitment to ensuring that we will not rest on our laurels in the context of our legislative framework, but that we will seek to ensure that we can reflect, that we can examine areas of improvement, and to be able to do so, Mr. President, and to be able to bring these things to the table, particularly in the context of the current environment. And the current environment in this context, we recognize, Mr. President, that the ILO has just recently, I believe, if I'm correct, just last month of June of 22, made health and safety one of the fundamental rights for workers. So that previous to that, there were only 4 fundamental rights, and the ILO has just, in June of 2022, agreed that this should be one of the fundamental rights. And here we are, Mr. President, as a government, in July of 2022, making the necessary amendments to our act to ensure that we remain in compliance and that we are reflective of the current environment. It's a demonstration, Mr. President, of government's ongoing commitment. I also want to suggest as well, Mr. President, if you will allow me, just to reflect just a little bit. I've had, Mr. President, a long history of working in the development sector. I consider myself a little bit of, not a little bit, perhaps in a past life, an activist. And that meant, Mr. President, that I was actively involved in advocating for rights and human rights across a number of different areas, which included those for women and included those for workers. I was ardent activist, Mr. President, for the inclusion of decent work in international trade agreements. In that life, we believed fundamentally that decent work was a principle that should be applied in the context of our engagements in the international arena and in international trade agreements to ensure that workers were treated fairly. The ILO, Mr. President, defines decent work as productive work for women and men in conditions of freedom, equity, security, and human dignity. And again, Mr. President, emphasizing that enshrining workers' rights and ensuring that workers are protected requires a broad framework so that the concept of decent work talks about it pays a fair income, so that's the remunerative aspect of it. But secondly, it guarantees a secure form of employment and safe working conditions, Mr. President. It ensures equal opportunities and treatment for all, includes social protection for workers and their family, and it offers prospects for personal development and encourages social integration. So that, Mr. President, I'm hoping that we're getting the picture that in the context of the frame for our discussion has to be creating an environment where workers are able to feel safe, and in that context as well, uplifting, Mr. President, uplifting the state of workers in this country. But, Mr. President, one of the things that I recognize in the context of my advocacy, and I was a very strident advocate, Mr. President, I was known for breaking up meetings and speaking very loudly from the floor and putting very strident positions on the table in various fora. Even as far as the World Trade Organization, Mr. President, again, speaking to this fundamental issue. Because certainly, as a child of Barbados in the colonial past, certainly I was convicted. But until we address this issue of decent work in its fullness, then that we will not have been able, in the context of our international trade agreements, to be able to fully protect workers. But at the same time, Mr. President, what I realized is that even while my advocacy, as I indicated, was strident in the context of the international arena, that we have to make sure that we have our house in order locally as well. So that the advocacy of the international arena must be matched by strong national legislative frameworks that enshrines the necessary protection and conditions for workers. But we can only do that, Mr. President, if there is a strong and shared understanding and respect for workers' rights. And Mr. President, we would think that this is something that is not necessarily debatable, that there is a shared understanding of the importance of ensuring workers' protection, ensuring that there is a safe environment for workers to operate in. We would assume, Mr. President, that this is, something that there is a full consensus about. But, Mr. President, if we look to perhaps recent past, we would suggest that perhaps that consensus doesn't necessarily exist, and the reason, therefore, for us to have a strong legislative framework. Mr. President, I don't want to go back too far into history, but it would be remiss of me if I did not remind this honourable chamber that our history is one based on a colonial past, and that colonial past was based on a framework of worker exploitation, that it was based on a framework of Black working class exploitation that was enshrined in the context of a capitalist system, in which, Mr. President, profit was the holy grail, and the worker was not seen as anything else than a part of the machinery in order to deliver that profit. And therefore, the creation of an environment for workers was not necessarily at the forefront in the context of that capitalist system, Mr. President. And therefore, if you have a system that does not easily recognize, does not easily want to take into consideration such matters as workers' rights and such matters as protection, then it falls to the state to be able to ensure that it can build the necessary framework for that protection. Our society, Mr. President, in particular, has been continually forged, particularly, and I speak to the past now, by that contention between the working class and the owning class. And the riots of 1937, Mr. President, are perhaps reflective of that contention. But I also want to suggest, Mr. President, that very often we look at the 1937 riots as that signal moment without necessarily recognizing that all throughout our history there have been moments in Barbadian history when workers have been saying to the owning class, you need to do better, you need to do more, we need to do different. And while that has catalyzed in the context of the 1937 riots and the Moyne Commission, which exposed the very base conditions, very base living and working conditions of Blacks at that particular time, Mr. President, I want to reiterate that there's been a history, we have a history in the context of Barbados of workers continually saying this is not enough and we need to be able to do better. So there's a recognition of that, Mr. President. So that we then have to have a framework that allows us to be able to protect workers' rights and ensure, as I said before, Mr. President, that their conditions are such that workers feel safe, that their health is protected, and that workers then can contribute effectively to their workplace, because I believe that is what we want, Mr. President. We want workers who will be able to contribute. We want workers who will turn up at their various workplaces feeling like I can come to this place and I am fundamentally part of this workplace, and therefore I will give honest work and honest effort in the context of this work environment. And Mr. President, I am not suggesting that this legislation or any piece of legislation is necessarily going to imbue that, but I am suggesting that the legislation creates a framework in which there is a signal that this is the intent that we are working towards, Mr. President. And certainly, I am pleased to be part of a government that has been on the forefront of this recognition of the need to ensure that our workers are taken care of and that their rights are respected. In the other place, the Honourable Member for St. Peter talked about the fact that the history of the Barbados Labour Party is indelibly tied up in the souls of the working class. That successive governments have introduced various pieces of legislation under a Barbados Labour Party administration that were intended to secure workers' rights and to bring the necessary acknowledgement of the need to enhance the conditions of workers in this country. And that recognition and that history of legislation was based on a principle, Mr. President, that I want to make sure that we do not miss again. That national development is, yes, important in the context of the contribution of the private sector. But the private sector does not contribute on its own. Companies and institutions do not contribute and gain profit on their own. It is the workers, fundamentally, who contribute to that. So that as a country, as we intend to reform, as we intend to address issues of worker productivity, as we intend to address issues of how we ensure that our economy grows, then tied up with that also, and we keep talking about diversification of the economy, et cetera, which are important, but then we have to make sure that we do not miss fundamentally what is happening with our workers, Mr. President. What is happening with our workers. And this legislation applies to all categories of workers, because there would be the suggestion that we are talking sometimes only about middle managers and CEOs and all those sorts of things. But this legislation fundamentally seeks to ensure that there is protection for all categories of workers, that we ensure that workplaces are safe, Mr. President, for those that work at the gas stations, Mr. President, for those that work in areas that require a level of danger, Mr. President, and to ensure that there is essentially a recognition of the need, like I keep saying, to make sure that these workplaces are what I'm going to call fit for purpose, fit for the employees that will be working in these environments. Mr. President, I want to again indicate that this position of the fact that worker safety and the importance of worker safety is one, as I indicated before, that has been taken on board by the ILO now as a fundamental right, and also as well the emerging research, again, on the importance of occupational health and safety as being critical to increasing productivity, but also as well emerging research that shows that, again, workers' attitude about their task, and further research that also indicates that workers then are more inclined to themselves make recommendations for improvements in environments where their employers are already seeking to put measures in place, so that there is a symbiotic relationship that continues to happen in the context of when workplaces are improved for the benefit of workers. A worker that is safe and sees that their employer is making efforts, feels more inclined, according to the research, to be able to say to that employer, there's a circumstance which needs attention. Are you willing to be able to make the necessary changes? So that the worker feels more connected to that particular workplace. The amendments, Mr. President, that we refer to as the SHAW Act, the Safety and Health at Work Act, includes, Mr. President, the allowance for the making of regulation. So currently within CAP 365, section clause 105 to 108, it allows for the minister to make regulations on a number of different areas. So regulations, Mr. President, in relation to drinking water, in relation to general duties, in relation to noise, personal protective equipment, sanitary conveniences, washing facilities, workstations and fuel stations, medical supervision, etc. But what has not happened previously, Mr. President, is that these regulations were actually put in force, so that we had an act that made provisions for regulations that then there were actually no regulations. So the amendment, one of the areas of the amendment allows now for for making sure that we have these necessary regulations. And Mr. President, I want to spend some time talking a little bit about these areas in relation to the need for a strong regulatory framework, Mr. President. Because again, I think that, you know, when we talk about workers and safety, we can sometimes not fully appreciate or understand the impact that some working conditions can have on workers. So one of the areas is about the issue of noise and the impact that certain workplaces that have a high level of noise, the Act speaks to a particular decibel level, can then perhaps lead to issues of hearing for workers. Do we think about that, Mr. President? Do workplaces actively think about the impact that the noise level, when you have construction going on, do they provide earmuffs for their workers and those sorts of things, Mr. President, that are critical? And again, these are things in the context of a work environment that sometimes we do not always understand. And I believe as well, Mr. President, I would say that even from the context of the employees, that sometimes in the eagerness to do the job, that we don't necessarily take into consideration as being critical to impacting our health. And therefore, the amendment then allows us, Mr. President, to make sure that we are able to put in place the necessary regulations to clarify for everyone how the protection for worker safety is supposed to happen as well. I have, Mr. President, a particular concern in relation to the provision of personal protective equipment. Just because, again, of my own history. My dad, even though it was in a context of someone who is self-employed, was a mechanic. And if you know anything about doing mechanic work, you know, one of the things that my dad used to do a lot, you know, he used to do a lot of welding on the cars, and so I grew up amongst these very large gas cylinders that were, you know, just about, and the house was there, and then the yard was there. I've never seen my dad wear, you know, any kind of protective equipment, but I see the scars on his hands from the burns, yeah, that he had. My dad is currently incapacitated, and that injury came about in the context of his work. You know, pulling a car and then damaging one of the areas behind his neck, and not necessarily taking care of that immediately, but progressively then that injury progressed until now he is incapacitated. So that there are practical, very practical, Mr. President, impacts of not taking care of worker safety in the context of the workplace, and particularly in terms of providing the necessary personal protective equipment that is important. Mr. President, one of the other areas as well speaks to the notion of sanitary conveniences. And again, you know, when we talk about issues of gender, again, extremely, extremely important that we don't take perhaps enough attention. So we have, and it's not only applies to women, but I'm speaking particularly to women in this particular context. We now have a number of women who are entering non-traditional areas of the workforce. So they are in construction sites, they're working, cleaning the roads, Mr. President, and in all areas. But very often, and certainly when I pass some of those sites, there are no sanitary conveniences that provide for workers to be able to take care of their necessary needs. And Mr. President, in the context of a modern workplace environment, it is critical that we appreciate these conveniences. And I don't want us, again, to gloss over, as I said before, these things that we may think as perhaps a little trivial and, why are we placing such emphasis on this? Why is the importance of it? But, Mr. President, that is because sometimes for many of us who work in different environments, in our air-conditioned environments, etc., we do not often think about others who work in environments in which they are in the hot sun from morning till night, till evening sometimes, Mr. President. What happens to that worker? What happens to that worker, Mr. President? How do we ensure that they have an environment where they can relieve themselves, where they can get water, drinking water, Mr. President? Basics of drinking water in this hot environment, in this heat wave, Mr. President. How will they be able to get drinking water? And not only just get drinking water, but that it be provided in a clean and sanitary way. So that, Mr. President, we're talking about a holistic frame that helps to uplift, protect, and ensure worker safety. One of the other critical provisions that the amendments introduces as well is that it allows for ensuring that workplaces now have to, Mr. President, display that certificate from the chief fire officer. So previously, they would have just have to include that certificate in the register, which they are required to keep. This amendment now says that you must display it publicly. And I don't think, Mr. President, that I have to speak to this, but just to be able to say that what this does is introduces a level of accountability for everyone. The public display reminds that employer that I have a responsibility, because sometimes we put it in the register, and we put that in a file, and nobody don't look back at it, and it's there amongst all the other papers, out of sight, out of mind. By putting it on public display, Mr. President, it reminds the employer that I have a responsibility to my workers to ensure that the office or the space in which they will operate complies and is in compliance with what is required in relation to fires. It also, as well, Mr. President, says to those that are coming into that environment, it reminds, because very often, as a shopper, sometimes, Mr. President, you don't necessarily pay attention. You go in, get what you want, and come out. You're not always conscious, of these things, about whether or not the store has the appropriate fire exits. But at least having it on display would mean that it is front of mind now to persons that are coming in, and it increases the accountability for me as now a consumer. Because once I see it in one place, I say, well, when I go to the next place, I want to know where you don't have yours. And it creates a dynamic, Mr. President, in which both the consumer as well as the owner then is aware of the need to ensure that that property is compliant. And, Mr. President, in our recent past, we've had an incident which demonstrated that perhaps, again, not perhaps, we need to be able to do better. And, Mr. President, I would not suggest that there are owners of properties who will deliberately put employees in an environment in which they're not compliant. But again, because we are not necessarily aware of the importance of these things, that they're not necessarily front of mind, and that in the context particularly of Bridgetown, we're speaking of buildings, that were developed long time ago, that before we had, a full understanding of the need to ensure that our working environments then are compliant. So that we have to be able to raise awareness, both from consumer in this society and as well as to owners, that they have a responsibility in order to ensure, like I said before, that their places are compliant. Least, Mr. President, we have dire, I say again, dire consequences. So this is an important amendment, Mr. President, that we are considering in the context of this bill as well. One of the other amendments is for the making of regulation so that we clarify what is at clause 93, Mr. President, the right for the worker to refuse dangerous task. But if we look at that, somebody would ask, what is a dangerous task? So that the clause itself is good, it is sound, and certainly, Mr. President, I would be very honest to say that before myself having to go through this, I did not necessarily appreciate that there was that right for the worker to be able to refuse a dangerous task. But what we need to be able to do is to have a greater robustness. And Mr. President, I want to also be clear that any kind of definition is perhaps not going to be able to cover the full gamut of what anyone may classify as a dangerous task, but at least it allows us to, in the context of making of the regulation, to be able to clarify what are some critical elements in terms of the definition of a dangerous task, Mr. President. And again, the importance of this cannot be understated. We have workplaces in Barbados. We have construction that is happening in Barbados. And as we improve our infrastructure, it requires for new techniques in terms of construction. We're dealing with buildings now that are extremely high, Mr. President. And therefore, we have to be able to allow our workers to be able to indicate where they feel that they are in danger, Mr. President, where the task that has been assigned to them endangers their lives, so that this gives the worker agency in the context of their workplace. So now not as a passive recipient, but now the worker is empowered to be able to indicate, I do not feel safe in the task that you are asking me to undertake. But as we do that, Mr. President, as I said before, we have to be sure that there is clarity, so that both in the context of the employer, that he or she is not also bound by an employee who may, for whatever reason, say that I do not want to do a task that may be considered, that he may be considered not dangerous, and the employer doesn't consider to be the same, that there now is clarity of what that will be able to look like, Mr. President, and that everybody understands what are the critical tenets of when we see this dangerous task being evidence. So that, Mr. President, there are a number of other amendments as well in the context of CAP 365 that are being proposed. And while I will not speak to all of those amendments, I do want to note, Mr. President, as well, that essentially in the context of the amendment to Section 108 of CAP 365, we have, in addition to all of the other regulations that are being made there, as I indicated before, respecting a regulation now, respecting the right to refuse to carry out tasks where there's imminent danger to the health and safety of the employee, but also as well at I, prescribing the forms to be used for the purposes of this act, and also as well J, prescribing the fees to be paid for services provided under this act. So again, Mr. President, as I close, I want to reiterate that fundamental principle that this amendment is attempting to ensure, and the fundamental principle which, Mr. President, I want to remind this honourable chamber, that the Shaw Act was a Barbados Labour Party Administration Act, and part of the rich history that this party has had, long history and legacy of ensuring and enshrining workers' rights, that the fundamental principle is about creating a framework that uplifts the Barbadian workers. It is about responding to that history, that colonial history that saw the worker as unimportant in the context of being a worker in of his or herself, but that we needed to be able to recognize very frontally, that health and safety was a critical aspect of creating an environment that was empowering for workers in Barbados, Mr. President. I want to also close by saying, again, that the Act and its amendments apply to workers across Barbados. And I said that before, but I want to reiterate it, Mr. President, because, again, I think that we need to be able to assure the workers at all levels, particularly those that are working in jobs that, again, are outside of what we would call the comfortable working environment, that there is concern for them. Because essentially, the context for this, the fundamental principle that I talked about before, was about uplifting those workers and that class of workers, Mr. President. And this is what we have in the context of the Shaw Act, and the amendments are attempting to augment that in the context of today's reality. I'm obliged, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Monroe Knight. Senator Dr. Hines.
Mr. President, I do not beg that this bill be read a second time.
Senator Dr. Hines.
Thank you, and good morning. Mr. President, I am very happy to see that we are able to discuss safety and health in the workplace. This is really important for all of the reasons, really, that Senator Monroe Knight highlighted. When I saw that there was an amendment without opening it, my guess was that this amendment was going to address the changing nature of the workplace. And I was a little bit surprised to see that it does not address this at all. So these amendments I would welcome. What we see in the amendments is that they do address some errors in one regard in the legislation. So the changing of certain words that were put in there erroneously, that, inflammable versus flammable. We also do see some strengthening and clarification of various provisions, which I think is useful and laudable. However, what the COVID-19 pandemic has shown all of us is that the workplace is not just the brick and mortar workplace. It is not just that which exists in the so-called public sphere, which I think is what this legislation, for the most part, addresses. It does, so if we go back to the legislation, what we see is that there's a definition of the workplace that does indicate that a workplace can be within a private residence, but that is basically where it ends. And if we look at, and this is a very long piece of legislation, I have to confess, it took me a long time to get through this, and I hope that I am able to do it justice in what I'm saying here. So this definition of the workplace does acknowledge that the private sphere can be a workplace, but for the most part, what we see is that the provisions of the legislation speak to the public sphere. And we know that this pandemic has changed the nature of work so that many persons began to work from home. We could call this working remotely. There are other definitions that can be used. We can talk about teleworking, telecommuting, all sorts of work from home arrangements. And I believe that we need amendments to acknowledge occupational health and safety when persons' workplaces move into the home, move into the private sphere. The legislation, as I mentioned, has focused on things that are very conventional in our conceptualization of what is work and where work happens. And I heard Senator Monroe Knight talk about those who work in air-conditioned settings. But there are those who moved from those air-conditioned settings to doing the same kind of work in a place with no air condition at all, without necessarily proper ventilation or even an adequate workspace. They may have moved to work in a setting in which there are children in the workplace. There's noise, there are the kites with the bulls keeping constant noise, and they're required to work from home. Now, I'm not saying that an employer is going to be able to go into someone's home and change the conditions, their living conditions. They cannot change the conditions of the neighborhood either. They cannot do anything about the number of persons living in a place. However, I do think we need to have some provisions in place so that when persons are working remotely, working from home, telecommuting, that they have the safety considerations borne in mind and that these are not at their expense. So we know that there are provisions within office settings for things such as ergonomic, the chairs, the padding for your typing so that people don't get, carpal tunnel. So these things need to be taken into consideration when we move the workplace into the home. And this is not just for an emergency. Some people may say, oh, well, you know, the pandemic, this was just an emergency situation, but it really has changed how we think about work and how people work. And if we go back to the same International Labor Organization, the ILO, they have begun to provide such provisions, both in light of the pandemic and also in light of the changing nature of work. So they have provided recommendations, first of all, in the context of the pandemic, that relate to employers' responsibilities to check on their employees, to ensure that they are trained and that they are knowledgeable about how to be safe in conducting their duties from at home, and that also they provide the equipment that persons need not just to do their job, but to do their jobs safely at home, including things such as a workstation with the appropriate chairs and what other mechanisms are needed, let's say if it is office work. This could also apply to persons who are teaching that may need specific things. And I don't know if there are I'm speaking with some limited experience, but there may be other occupations or professions that may require persons to work from home, which may mean that some equipment may be taken into the home and safety considerations need to be borne in mind. And this is the responsibility of the employer. So it is not that we are just pushing the work into someone's private home and letting them deal with the working situation themselves. Things need to be put in place to ensure that people know about taking breaks, about standing up, taking breaks for your eyes, ensuring that perhaps there is some kind of division between your workspace and other spaces in the house. So you're not working on your bed next to a child, for instance. The other thing that I wanted to emphasize, the ILO and they have two documents that I looked at. One is an employer's guide to working from home. The other is working from home, and it uses a term that I was not familiar with, which is, can't find it now, but it basically deals with occupational health and safety in the household. I think they call it human and ergonomic provisions. They also talk about making sure that appropriate provisions are put in place for persons with disabilities who are working within the household, within their home, their private homes. So this means that different provisions have to be put in place to facilitate workers who are differently abled. So these are some of the things that I would have loved to have seen in an amendment. Not that there is anything wrong with this current amendment, but I was hoping to see an amendment that takes into consideration how we are changing the workplace so that all of those people who are now in this new normal, whatever it will be, are also provided for in this legislation. And with those very few words, Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Hines. Senator Anveli Boyce.
Good morning, Mr. President. Thank you for recognizing me. I stand today in support of the amendments before the House and the attendant regulations, which seek to ensure that workers across this country have particular protections in relation to their health and safety as they work, Mr. President. And the bill is part of establishing a framework for the protection of workers, and as averred to by Senator Monroe Knight, is part of the government's commitment to using the policy space that it has to the benefit of Barbadians. There was a time, as we have heard, that there was a relationship defined, that the employer-employee relationship was defined by power and subjugation. And what we're attempting to do with this legislation is to ensure that there is a balance, Mr. President. A balance that recognizes the inherent value of workers, not only as producers and as producers of capital and production, but to ensure that they have the enabling environment to contribute economically and to self-actualize and to do so safely. And so this amendment is part of and this amendment, Mr. President, is part of a tradition of the Barbados Labour Party and administrations of this country ensuring that workers' rights are protected. As indicated, the regulations attendant to the Act speak to a number of things. And one of the things that I think we should spend some time on is is the idea that it imposes a responsibility on self-employed individuals, Mr. President. Because we have thought about this issue often in the context of the traditional employee-employer relationship. And conceiving of it in such a limited way has inured to the detriment of workers. And this administration is making good on the promise of ensuring protection for all. And so there is a regulation that imposes a duty on self-employed individuals self-employed individuals to ensure that all of the regulations in relation to drinking water, noise, workstations, and all of the others are provided where necessary. Mr. President, this bit of legislation also has to be put in context. The context, of course, being that our international obligations as a member of the ILO commit us to providing protections to our workers and ensuring that they are protected as they work. Mr. President, we talk a lot in this country and globally about workers' stress, the likelihood of workers, the likelihood of workers becoming stressed because they have to occupy particular environments, and the need for the employer to ensure that as far as reasonably possible, they don't contribute to heightened stress for the employer. And so, in my view, these protections are a signal part of ensuring that we ensure the wellness and the stress reduction for employers across this country. Because with the imposition, or the enactment is perhaps the appropriate term, of these regulations, there are certain things employees will no longer have to concern themselves with, because the law will require that their employees commit themselves, as I indicated, in various ways to ensuring health and safety at work. And there is a correlation, as has been indicated, between reduced stress, happy employees, and greater productivity. Mr. President, I want to spend some time there because because of the traditional way in which we have often thought about the employer-employee relationship and how historically we have viewed that relationship, there may be a view, albeit undesirable, that these regulations and the amendments to the Act create an added set of responsibility for employers. And I want to say that these regulations, Mr. President, are really to the benefit of both the employee and the employer. In relation to the employer, they establish standards and make it very clear what should be done in relation to discharging with the responsibility of ensuring that workers are well protected, Mr. President. And thus it prevents contention in the workplace. It prevents litigation outside the workplace because the standards are clear, and where the standards are adhered to and where an employer discharges appropriately with the responsibility, he is protected. And that is also a benefit, Mr. President. Senator Dr. Hines spent some time talking about the evolving environment of work, that it is no longer you get up every day and you go to a brick and mortar place and you do work. And she criticized would perhaps be the appropriate word, the legislation for not, in her view, appropriately speaking to those things. Mr. President, there is a future of work committee, and let me recognize that Senator Dr. Hines is correct when she says that there is an evolving relationship of work, that the way that we think of work is not the way it used to be. Let me say that there is a Future of Work Committee, Mr. President, that is plotting the country's way forward in relation to the issues, to those issues. And that committee is chaired by the General Secretary of the Barbados Workers Union. Again, a recognition that this government is being what my development colleagues refer to as policy agile, using the space they have to respond to the evolving realities and the problems that we have. And so I just want to say that in response to Senator Dr. Hines. In addition to that, the government has considered and approves a flexible work arrangements in recognition of many of the realities that came to be in the context of COVID, and the fact that women in particular have care responsibilities that may make adhering to the traditional strictures of work, that's 8:30 to 4:30, 9 to 5 construct, problematic. And so again, the government is and remains committed to ensuring that they respond to the realities as they confront us, Mr. President. If we widen the aperture a little bit, the government is also ensuring that history does not repeat itself. And if we all know, Mr. President, that if we do not take care in ensuring that it does not repeat itself, it will. And so there was a time in this country when the stories of persons being injured at work for lack of the proper protections in various ways was common, Mr. President. And we're ensuring that in this Barbados, those things are lessened, and that where those protections do not exist, there are penalties for their absence, Mr. President. The legislation, the amendments also seek to do a little bit of tidying up of the drafting, Mr. President. Drafting is a tedious process, a process that requires great care. And in the evolving circumstances, Mr. President, there may be things that need to be changed. And so these amendments and the attendant regulations take care to respond to those things and to fix them. And something for which I am particularly grateful, and I'm sure employers are grateful as well, given that these are the standards to which they will be held. Mr. President, this legislation, when we broaden the aperture, is about justness and about ensuring that at all levels and in all ways, we ensure the protection of persons who are employed and who contribute to society through employment, Mr. President. The legislation and regulations create an environment in which employees, employers can feel protected, knowing that there is recourse, there is an amended document that responds to many of the evolving challenges and realities of our society that they can go to protect themselves and to ensure that they are protected, Mr. President. And so it is in that context that I give my full support to the legislation and to the attendant regulations. Mr. President, I am obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Andrele Boyce. Senator Malalu.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon to everyone. Let me start by saying, Mr. President, that I do not rise to object to anything in any of the amendments. But I would say that the bill falls short of the standard that Senator Monroe Knight stated, where government's ongoing commitment to ensuring that we will not rest on our laurels, we will reflect on areas of improvement. I think we've missed a big opportunity here, and I will support what my fellow Senator, Dr. Hines, that government has missed an opportunity to amend it, to bring forward amendments to this bill to reflect what we have learned through this very difficult time of the pandemic, now 2.5 years on. Senator Hines spoke to the remote work and the concept that the workplace perhaps is not just the physical place that we report to, but it may well extend to home and other remote areas, and the tools and equipment that we should have to be able to work in a healthy and safe environment in those areas. And that's an excellent point, one that I had not considered. But what I had considered was, and let me take a step back for a second. It's interesting that the underlying bill that we're amending contains 136 pages. It contains 138 sections, of which I know that all of my fellow senators have taken the time to read and understand, read every word. But there are 15 lines in that underlying legislation that have not been mentioned here at all, and 15 lines only in section 9 of the legislation that places an equal burden on a safe and healthy workplace on the employees. But that is not mentioned. And in this pandemic, what we did learn, if anything at all, is that we needed to be responsible for each other. What personal choices we made affected everyone around us, Mr. President. And I want to highlight to my fellow senators Section 9. I want to highlight it in the words and the meaning of it. It requires and obligates employees to take reasonable care of the health and safety of themselves and of persons who may be affected by their acts or omissions, and to cooperate with their employer so far as necessary to enable the duty imposed on the employer by the same act. And I think we have missed a huge opportunity. We are missing a huge opportunity in these amendments not to address that which was in the media, in the public forum for the last 24 months at least, since vaccinations were available, since testing was available. It is clearly now proven that it is irresponsible of someone who may be ill to go into a workplace. But why have we not taken this opportunity in these amendments to make it absolutely clear that it is an employee's responsibility not to bring sickness into a workplace? So I am standing for these few brief moments just to highlight 15 lines, Section 9, 1A especially. And remember, I have no objection to any of the amendments, but I will disagree with my fellow senator on the other side that we have done everything we should. There was more that could be done, there was more that should be done, and I look forward to seeing a further amendment that addresses these areas. I'm obliged to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Malalouf. Senator Nurse.
Thank you, Mr. President, for recognizing me. And I stand to make a small contribution to this debate in regard to these amendments to the Health and Safety at Work Act. And let me say up front, Mr. President, that I am happy to support the bill. I believe, I am firmly of the belief that any laws, any regulations which are brought into force and are in the interest of improving the lot of employees and workers in, in terms of the environment and their comfort and better working facilities are very important things which we need to be able to support and which I think are absolutely necessary if workers are to be able to enjoy going to work, are going to be willing to become much more productive citizens because they have comfortable working spaces and working environments, Mr. President. And so I am happy to be able to be part of this overall legislation which seeks to put in place improvements in the working environment. Mr. President, it is important, I think, for us to recognize that this legislation and these amendments, and indeed the legislation which currently exists, places responsibility not only on employers, but there's certain responsibility, I think, as well for employees, for the regulators, the inspectors who have to go out and do their job, for suppliers who supply materials that are used, say, in manufacturing products, which eventually are consumed by people like us. So, to my mind, this legislation can have useful implications for all stakeholders. And so I just want to quickly look at it from the point of view of a few things for employers, few obligations, I think also from the employee's perspective. And as I said, in general, that we need to ensure we improve upon as we go along. And Mr. President, some important ones have already been raised, and I don't wish to rehash all of them, but I just would like to add to some that have been raised, some other issues which concern me. For example, just last week I was in the Warrens district, Warrens area, and I was remarking how Warrens is now becoming, it effectively is taking over from the city of Bridgetown as our main town center. And I was looking at the number of buildings that have got up there, but not only one or two-story buildings, but when you look around, all of the buildings in that area seem to me to be in excess of 6-story buildings, or most of them anyway, and I believe some go up probably as high as about 10 stories. And so they're very modern buildings, of course, Mr. President. And you don't, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't seem to see, for example, a lot of, let's say, windows in those type of buildings, for ventilation and so on. They're nice, pretty buildings with a lot of glass and so on, encasing the outside. And I'm wondering, in terms of safety for the workers who work in those buildings, in terms of safety for people like us, the consumers and so on, who have to be in those buildings, what is the level of safety that exists, that if there be some disaster, if there be some fire, for example, will the fire service be in a position to be able to adequately manage and control those situations? And I think I say that because while we may say, well, that's not all part, all part of what we're talking about today, in fact, it is. Because as far as I'm concerned, and as I said before, health and safety affects all of us because we all interact when we have to visit these various places of business and so on. And so I think it is something that we should make sure we pay attention to, make sure that we have adequate protections for fire hazards and so on, and that our fire service has the capacity and the training and the ability to be able to take charge of any unfortunate situations that might occur in that area. And so, Mr. President, I also just wanted to mention, as I speak about buildings, And we know that they have, from time to time, there are also other issues with buildings, particularly government buildings, Mr. President. But, and, you know, and this seems to be an area, sir, where government sometimes I seem to think becomes, and I'm not specifically speaking to this administration, but I'm talking about administrations from as far back as I can remember, that these administrations always seem to be the chief offenders when it comes to maintaining proper maintenance of their buildings. And eventually, you know what happens? They get so bad that the employers have to come out, they have to demonstrate, it has to be a big press. You know, the press has to be involved and it has to be broadcast and so on before action is taken to look after and to maintain these sick buildings. And I think that perhaps one of the things that, for example, that we may have to look at when we see some regulations, should there be some annual requirement for inspections of buildings to be taken, to be done? Should there be some sign-off, for example, to ensure that air conditioning and other ventilation systems are properly examined and signed off and a certificate issued? Because, as I said, too often we are seeing this, and as I said, in the government, so in the case of government, where employees have to come out and demonstrate in order to get some action. And you know what happens, of course, Mr. President? When it gets so bad, the building is abandoned. And you go and you look for a building to rent, or you go and you build a completely new office block. And that in itself is a huge impact on the cost of running government. Just very recently, I recall, and I stand corrected if I say the wrong person, but I recall either the Minister of Housing or the senior minister without portfolio mentioning the huge rental bill, which government has to pay to rent facilities for accommodations of its employees. And that can be avoided, I think, largely if government were willing to to put some money in their annual estimates of revenue and expenditure to ensure that buildings are properly maintained. And I have heard various civil, from more than one civil servant who says, look, you know, we go to the estimates every year and we sit down with the Ministry of Finance and the ministry goes through their budget. And very often you having a budget for maintenance, and you're directed to cut it out. And I've heard this. I have heard civil servants say that they'll be, you know, and this is something which government, as I said, can, an area where I think governments, not picking on this particular government or any government, but generally, this is an area where I think governments need to do better. and to ensure that their employees enjoy the kind of environments that they're enjoyed by workers in the private sector. And the government can't be the regulators through the Ministry of, or I said it can't, but it should not be the regulators through the Ministry of Labor, but yet be the chief offenders. It has got to change. And this situation is not only in terms of government offices, but you're seeing it in the schools. How often have we been hearing in recent times, in recent years, about various problems in the schools? Even as we speak now, Mr. President, I believe there is still one school that hasn't been, is still under refurbishment because of various environmental issues. This Honourable Senate and the others in the other place had to move out 2-3 years ago because of some of the same issues right here. And so it is a serious problem, and I would like to see that government change its focus in that direction in terms of maintenance of its buildings. Just as well, there are just a few other things I would like to pick up on. For example, I think that in doing the various improvements, one of the group of workers that came to my mind were the sanitation workers, Mr. President. The workers who work in cleaning the sewers and the drains and people of that, in that category. And I have to say that I really have to take my hat off and to salute those people, particularly those sanitation workers, who I have the utmost of respect for and who I think are doing the best of jobs. And now, of course, that they have proper or much better equipment, I see the difference in terms of the overall environment as we move around and so on. So I want to congratulate them on doing a good job. And I would just say that there are some other areas, and I'm not sure if they've been addressed up to now, but for example, I think it should be mandatory that sanitation workers should have a free education, a free examination, health examination done every 6 months. So, it is critical, I think, for those categories of workers. And we spoke of the effects of the recent pandemic. And again, from time to time, we sort of heard little things about proper equipment being available, proper PPE equipment and so on. And I would like to think that we recognize that these are all important issues that have to be addressed under the safety and health legislation. But as I said before at the beginning, Mr. President, this legislation is for not only employers, but for other stakeholders, for employees as well. And I think employees too have responsibilities to ensure that this legislation is enforced. For example, I think it is important that employees recognize that if they see something in the workplace or a procedure happening in the workplace, which in their view it could be dangerous, they need to report it. If machinery, for example, is not being used properly, or you're being directed to use machinery in a way in which it should not be used, it should be necessary, employees should take it upon themselves, one, to refuse if they're being asked or forced or coerced to work under conditions that are less than satisfactory. They need to report it. And there should be in the regulations a formal system of having to report it, and it be properly documented and investigated and reported back on to whoever, the employee or employees that would have made the complaint. And in raising this point also, I just want to mention, we from time to time, and when I say we, I speak of Barbados and the government of Barbados, have from time to time employed foreign firms, foreign construction firms, for example, to do some work here in Barbados and construct various buildings and so on. And from time to time, it has emerged that these foreign contractors who also are bringing their foreign workers, it has emerged that the conditions under which some of these people are operating is less than ideal, less than what we as Bajan employees and workers are accustomed to. And I raise that point because I recognize that government has recently entered into a substantial contract for road rehabilitation and road construction along the East Coast, and a foreign firm is going to be doing it is going to be doing that work and employing substantial amount of foreign workers. And so I just want to remind government that they must demand the same level of safety and health for all workers, and not allow any particular foreign firm to come in and do and work and perform as they like, to the detriment of either the foreign workers or our own local workers that may be employed on those projects. And we have to insist that whatever standards we have set in Barbados, that they are followed throughout. Mr. President, I also want to just caution and remind employees that they have part of their responsibility also has to be that when they are supplied with various equipment with which they should be working, that they use that equipment, that they be not allowed to deviate from the directives or from the operating instructions, and that furthermore, supervisors must insist that, if you have to use a mask or if you have to use gloves or some face shield or something for the noise reduction or whatever, that they are put in place and that they are not just there, but they are being utilized. And if you are not prepared to use the safety equipment that is necessary, then you should not be allowed to work that bit of machinery or to be on the site or to be out in that environment as the case may be. So I just raised those to point out or to make employees recognize that, you know, they too have their various obligations as well to ensure that this works well and that it is enforced. I just had a little note here as well, but I believe it may, I believe it has actually raised, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it again, but just for what it's worth, we recognize the changing environment and the change of work and the way in which people are working. And it's even before COVID. I remember in my former life, before I retired, Mr. President, and working for international, as part of an international firm. And back then, you know, they had arrangements for working at home, for example. So, and I'm talking about going back now into the 90s and so on. So it's not exactly something that just happened because of the COVID. And I raise that point because if you are working from home, as I believe was pointed out, the onus, I believe, still has to be on the employer to ensure that the conditions and the facilities and the equipment for which you have to work at home is of the standard that you have the necessary comforts. I know that when COVID overtook us and people were working from home, they would have had some difficulties and stresses because of not having the proper chairs and you know, proper equipment and so on. But as this work from home becomes more entrenched into the working environment, I think that there is incumbent on employees, employers to maybe be given some level of subvention or whatever financial support may be necessary to ensure that the work from home facilities are just as, if not more comfortable, you know, on the same level as if they were out to work. And I am not knocking working from home. It's a good thing because, as I was saying, or in terms of working for the international firm, it allowed flexibilities. For example, mothers with newly born babies who could stay at home even after the 3 months period and, you know, and raise those young babies and so on while still working from home and producing and being able to breastfeed and whatever is necessary in the comfort of their homes. And so I would like to think that those would be aspects that would be looked at as well. Finally, one other point I just want to touch on is national insurance, Mr. President. And we may begin to ask, well, why is national insurance being discussed as part of this safety and health at work legislation? But there again, from time to time, and more often than we would like to see, you hear of issues where employers are collecting the national insurance payments but are not paying them over to the National Insurance Department. And then something happens to the employee and they're put in a certificate. And then they can't get the benefits to which they're entitled because you hear, but no national insurance has been paid in for you for X amount of months or whatever the case may be. And on a not so related thing, we saw during COVID what happened to employees whose employers, because of the COVID situation, might have been forced to close down and were left in limbo to be able to get those benefits. And somehow we need to strengthen the legislation in terms of the national insurance legislation and whatever else to make it more robust so that the occurrences of such becomes a thing of the past. And so, Mr. President, those are the few points I just wanted to raise, and I am happy to support these amendments, and I look forward to seeing the regulations as they are released from time to time. And I am obliged to you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Nurse. Senator King.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I want to take the opportunity to say, one, I am very pleased at these amendments, but at the same time, Mr. President, I'm also torn. I'll tell you why I'm torn. In 1985, a young man with whom I'm intimately associated with sang a song called I Want a Plantation. And in this song, that young man talked about a situation that existed then with workers in the agricultural sector not having access to bathrooms facilities. In 2022, that young man is standing in front of you having the same conversation all over again. It is difficult, Mr. President, to comprehend or even to try to understand why it would take so long for us to reach this juncture. What does it say about us as a people, as how we view ourselves? I listened very carefully to a number of my colleagues speaking. Senator Malou made the point that this is not just only about employers, but it's also about the responsibility of employees. And then you have those persons who are self-employed themselves. And I'm going to give you a little story because there's something that has transpired, not only in Barbados, but across the world, when it comes to workers in two particular sectors, which no one pays any attention to at all. One, the entertainment fraternity. The whole world laughed in some instances, and in some instances made a lot of comments about an incident that happened at the highest level of entertainment where someone had access to walk onto a stage and slap another person. It might seem irrelevant, but I'll get to the point so you understand. In my own experience as an entertainer on a cruise line ship, on a cruise liner, I had to deal with, I can say it clear, drunken passengers wanting to confront me or to come up onto the section that is for me, the entertainer. Either verbally, well, I think most of them looking at me probably figured that the physical part it ain't going there. But to have yourself subjected to it, this is not relegated to cruise ships. We have people working here in hotels who will find themselves subject to the same kind of abuse if measures are not put in place to deal with it. And for many years, we talk about health and safety. Many of the establishments within which these very people have to work do not even provide for dressing rooms. They do not take into consideration the type, especially for persons who are dancers, the types of platforms that these people have to work on. If you're talking about working conditions, where many of dancers' careers can be cut short due to injury because you got them working on cement. Working conditions that are really not conducive to what you're asking them to do. But nobody, barring nobody, thinks about these things, because when we talk about workers, people within that sector and people within the sporting arena are relegated to has been, or having not arrived, or basically having no rights. But I walk with this document that I read a lot. Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 23. It speaks about workers' rights. I'm not going to read the declaration, but I will give you 3 simple things. Everyone has a right to a job. Everyone has a right to a fair wage. And everyone has a right to join a trade union. 3 very important things. Out of those 3, 2 of them, again, directly for that same entertainment industry that I'm talking about, are problems that people face up to today in 2022. And so, Mr. President, you will forgive me if I sound a little bit agitated, because I am. It is unacceptable that in 2022, people are still grappling, or that we can beat our chests on certain things that are basic human rights. I understand when Dr. Hines spoke about the changing environment within which we find ourselves, but this is life. Life is itself ever-changing. It's not static. And the reason why we are in here is to be able to be as agile as humanly possible, where on some instances it may fall short, to be able to point those things out so that we can make the necessary changes. So I find it a little difficult to accept when I hear people saying that they are disappointed that something didn't go the full gambit. Because life in itself is a process. And you learn, and you change, as things go along. Nobody's perfect. But the important thing is to be able to recognize where the shortcomings are and to do what is necessary to correct those. I believe that at this juncture, there has to be an effort by the Ministry of Labor, GIS, whoever else can get on board the media to get those self-employed persons to begin to understand and educate themselves on these acts. This one in particular, to understand how it affects them, to understand that some of the decisions that some of the very employees make, how they in turn connect to their own families. So I'll give you a classic example. You can go anywhere across this island, and you can see people working with chemicals. No respirators, sometimes no overalls, sometimes no gloves. And if you are driving with your car glass down and you're not careful, the same spray that they're spraying with finds itself all over you when you're passing. Because nobody stops to say, well, you know, let me stop for a minute while the traffic passing. No, they continue doing what they're doing. So they're putting themselves at risk based on the fact that for someone, I've heard people saying all the time that they feel uncomfortable in all of these things, that outside hot and all this. But the reality is, if you don't take the necessary action and you're exposing yourself to these kind of chemicals and things that you're working with, the possibility of loss in its widest form comes along. One, you can lose your ability to work through illness. You lose the ability to work. It means then that you lose the ability to support your families or family or yourself. You lose that, people lose the standard of living. You lose that, you also lose your life. And it all comes from something that no government, no one person can legislate. That's conscience and culture. I listened very carefully to the Honourable Member speak about the lack of maintenance in public. This is culture. This is not anything that now start. This has been this way, as the old people say, since Adam was a lad. You can't legislate a culture. You have to begin the process of putting these things in place that will deal with ensuring that you have maintenance plans for these buildings, that there are standards and codes and different things like that, that you have to. But if at the same time we pass these legislations, which we come in to this hallowed chambers and do often, but then there is no real recourse for when people or institutions blatantly disregard them. It's spinning on mud. So one cannot go without the other. And everything in my mind oftentimes goes back to education, education, education in its widest form. Not just academic education. What was the responsibility of you as a citizen to the other person? For the mere fact, Mr. President, that any society anywhere in the world has to continuously create legislation after legislation after legislation. What does it tell you? I believe Senator Rogers will probably understand where I'm going with this. It speaks volumes about the psychological and the ethical part of the society itself. So if I had to come to work and I had to beg yourself, Mr. President, to allow the air conditioning unit to go on because we were roasting in here, would be telling me that you're inhumane. It speaks volumes about where we are at and how we treat to each other. And a lot of what we are looking at here are things that have been going on in this country for eons. For eons. And I understand where Senator Hines was going. As things change, we have to, again, I go back to being agile to be able to move towards things. But this in itself is a monumental step, which you can't take for granted. It might not be 100% perfect at this point in time. But a lot of the things that we do today, in 20 years' time, we have to make more adjustments as the world changes. And we have to be prepared to accept that you're not going to be able to get everything right in one go. And so, as I said before, I totally support these amendments. There are things that I myself are reflecting on it that I didn't think about, but just listening to some of the other senators speak gives me an opportunity to go back and reflect on some of the things and probably make my own recommendations on some of the other things. But I think it is important that as we look at this bill and the ramifications of it for the betterment of both the employers, the employees, for productivity in Barbados, which will benefit all of us. It's important that those sectors that I spoke about, both in sport and in the cultural industries, that we pay a little bit more attention to these particular areas. You know, it is saddening that as the world changes, one can go online and see simple things that children should be enjoying. But you're seeing in other parts of the world, it probably hasn't happened, to the best of my knowledge, in Barbados on a large scale as yet. But you have kids with coaches in children's games and things like that, and parents attacking coaches. They're at work too, you know. The coach is a worker. And I know from being Minister for Sport and for Culture, you know, that these things are realities that we have to now grapple with. And that's why I always say that when it comes to a lot of the issues that we face, it is easy for somebody to get up and point the finger at private sector or whoever else. But if we are honest with ourselves, oftentimes government must set the example that everybody else is to follow. Government must set the example. It doesn't matter which government it is, but government must set the example that others are to follow. And so that when I drive around, and I'll be very candid, and you see sanitation vans, and you see some of the fellas behind it have no mask, have no respirator, just got the gloves. You ask yourself, dealing with all these things, what are you taking home? But as I said before, you can't legislate people to behave in a certain way. You can't legislate behavior. But we've got to try in some way to get those persons who find it difficult to comply with things that people take time and effort to sit down and go through and work towards in order to improve life for everybody. And you've got to find a way to ensure that when people go against the grain, that there are consequences, that there are responsibilities for it. And so, Mr. President, with those few words, I just really wanted to draw the attention of this chamber to some of the things that I think we need to look at that are connected to what we're doing here. But I believe that at this juncture, we are where we are. I still feel there's a lot more to be done, but that is to be done on the individual level. And I just want to say that I'm very pleased at where we are. And with those few words, sir, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator King. Senator Harewood.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I rise, Mr. President, to give my support to the bill before this honorable chamber. I must admit I'm motivated in a special way to make my contribution, not because I've done a bit of preparation, but because of the feedback that I'm hearing coming from both sides of this particular chamber. I am really excited. If I had the opportunity to, and I would not want to do it now, I would sit down and listen to the contributions once again. Many things that I supported, many things I didn't think about, but I really must commend the quality of the contributions thus far. I'm looking forward to the contributions following mine as well. Mr. President, Mr. President, today we are discussing the Shaw Act. And I must just give a very brief recollection in terms of its origins. For those who may not know, it was a replacement to the Factories Act back in 2005. And the Factories Act focused mainly on industrial activity, whereas the Shaw Act encompassed work life within all aspects of work. With the exclusion back in 2005 of those workers who were working in the military and the armed forces, I believe also excluded at that time at the personal household level in terms of residences, and it also excluded some work on cruise ships, on ships as well. I'm very happy to hear the contribution that was made by Senator by Senator King. Mr. President, one thing that it did do, though, it did bring over the vast majority of the rights and responsibilities from the Factories Act into the Shaw Act as we know it today. And in reading the regulations, because the Act focuses mainly, these amendments, focus mainly on two things that jumped to my mind. Three things. One is the corrections to some of the legal jargon, as Senator Boyce would have referred to earlier. Two was the expansion or expansion of the scope of the minister with respect to making regulations. And three was the actual appending of the regulations that speak to the various sectors as well. And one that stood out to me as I came down here this morning and on my regular commute was a regulation that spoke to the safety and health of gas attendants, which would fall under this particular aspect, those persons that work at fuel stations, not only gas stations in the public space, but also persons that handle fuel at the airport and the seaport as well. And I know that we can all agree that some of the conditions may be quite unbearable relative to where some of us sit. And many of these gas attendants work sometimes from 6 o'clock in the morning up to 10 o'clock in the night, and sometimes even a bit longer, depending on if some persons turn up for the shift or not. And one thing in this particular regulation that I spoke to was for the mandatory provision of health assessments on an annual basis so that we can ensure that the workers in those particular settings, also at the airport, are not being affected by the duties that have been assigned to them within this particular area. And then I raise an eyebrow with respect to, I love the intention, I agree with the intention, but cast my thought to the employer, and knowing very well that in some of these sectors, the retention rate is relatively low, and gas attendants they go out of service sometimes in less than 2 months, 3 months, 6 months. And if we have the annual inspection, health inspection being at a year, we may need to also give consideration at some point to perhaps adjusting it to suit them. And I am a government senator here saying that because I recognize that this is a particular amendment, in which we can build the plane and fly it at the same time. So we're providing you with the amendments today, but we recognize, based on your comments and our comments as well, that there is still room for improvement and that there will be improvement coming with regards to some of the areas mentioned. I also want to say that the bill, as Senator Nurse has alluded to, is a bill that is really establishing a relationship among employees, employers, service providers, and also the regulatory agencies. So employers have, and it's very well outlined here, they have their duties. The employees as well, as Senator Nurse would have alluded to, they are also given some manner of duties. Let me take, for example, Mr. President, the regulation that speaks to personal and protective equipment under Section 8, which speaks to the duties of the employees. And that particular duty outlines the care that the employees would also apply to the equipment that is provided to them. And it also speaks in Section 7 of the same regulation to the training, to ensure that even before you touch or use the particular types of equipment, that you're given that knowledge in terms of how to not only maintain it, but how to use it as well, how to detect when there's a misjudgment, when there's a misalignment in terms of the calibration of certain types of equipment as well. And I want to say that this amendment recognizes that persons are not just units of measure to be put into any business model to make a profit. Let us be very practical. Persons are units of measure, but they're not only units of measure because they constitute labor. So they're not only units of measure, but they're actually individuals. So there's a quantitative aspect, but this speaks to the qualitative aspect of preserving life in itself. It also, Mr. President, I must commend it in terms of acknowledging its alignment to the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular SDG 8. And SDG 8 speaks to, Section 8.8 speaks to the protection of labor rights and promotion of safety and secure work environments. So I want to make it lucidly clear that this government, in terms of its amendments, wants to ensure that it is also aligned to international standards. The one thing that came out to me as well with regard to this amendment was enforcement. And it is a discussion that I've heard time and time again, not only with this particular amendment, but I've heard time and time with almost every piece of legislation that has gone before this chamber and the other place, this particular term or many terms before. And it caused me some manner of excitement in terms of researching to see how people do similar things in different jurisdictions, Mr. President. So for instance, in Trinidad and Tobago, interestingly enough, they have something that is referred to as OSHA, which is the Occupational Safety and Health Authority. More interestingly enough, that replaced, similar to Barbados, that replaced something called the Factories Ordinance in Trinidad. But in Trinidad, they have the OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Authority, which falls under the Ministry of Labor again. But they have different jurisdictions throughout Trinidad and one in Tobago, and they're manned by at least 17 staff, and there's also a chief inspector within that particular substructure. So it's not necessarily the Ministry of Labor in that context that is executing or ensuring compliance, but they have an authority. When we look at England, back in 2001, they would have established the Health and Safety Commission, and that ran simultaneously with the Health and Safety Authority. whereas the Health and Safety Commission was more aligned to the policy coming from the Ministry of Labor, the Health and Safety Authority often was the entity that sought to ensure compliance at an industry-wide level. This is not the particular approach we're taking, and it is not necessarily a bad approach we're taking. I think back then with OSHA in Trinidad and the HSC and HSA in the UK, based on my research, there were significant limitations in terms of even technology to communicate some of the changes as well, and the environments were quite different. This does not mean that eventually, sometime in the future, if we do an assessment, that there may be a need to relieve some, if any, burden on the Ministry of Labor. But I'm saying this to say that we should give ourselves the opportunity through this construct to see how we can have different aspects of these regulations enforced. And if there is a need, we can come back to the table and see how we can help enhance it as well. Mr. President, I also want to speak to the issue of the regulations in terms of the carrot and stick approach. Now, I like construction. I would like to think that I do well in construction at home. And I spend a lot of time playing with water, sand, and stone. Some people may call it concrete. Others may just call it water, sand, and stone. Cement, correct. Water, cement, and stone. Thank you very much. See, I would like to know that I'm good, but thanks for the correction. Stone is concrete, correct. Without the stone is mortar. Thank you very much. But the one thing we should not assume in this chamber is that even though there are regulations, that the small contractor or the person that, the small contractor, yes, is not on the same level as the large contractors. They're not on the same level perhaps in terms of technology, but what I want to focus on is that they're not on the same level in terms of resources, financial resources in particular. And so while the occupational safe, the Shaw amendments here speak to a recommendation that many of the personal protective equipment be utilized, whether it be respirators, whether it be other equipment that they're using, we should also try to encourage those in the private sector to recognize that even though changes with regard to the regulations in the Shaw Act may not necessarily bring more profitability in the short term, that the changes are here to encourage the long-term contributions that persons can make in those sectors by way of making them safe. And it means, Mr. President, let's get granular with it, sorry. When you see persons working in the construction sector, and I've seen it, I've seen persons working on houses, going on scaffoldings, maybe 10, 15 feet in the air, and hardly many, if any, persons in Barbados wear harnesses strapped to those scaffoldings. People walk those scaffoldings left and right without any harness. They have on the reflective vest, but me as an individual passing by, that only tells me that I can see when you're falling. That's what the vest tells me. The harness tells me that there's some protection if you have to slip. And I've seen these harnesses being absent on construction sites where there are large prefab buildings in Barbados, and I've seen them in small houses as well. And I think this is where the regulations with regards to this Shaw Act shows that there should be a leveling of the playing field when it comes to the enforcement and monitoring, and to re-emphasize to Barbadians that there is no one above the law, above or beyond the law, in terms of any enforcement comes for this particular act as well, regardless of the size of your establishment. Thank you for supporting the government, sir. But I spoke to the carrot and stick approach. The stick approach is certainly here, and it allows us to know what ought not to be with regards to the regulations. But the carrot approach is where I urge the private sector. I don't want to delve into your specific operations, but if any specific funds, as Senator Nurse might have alluded to, can be made available to ensure that persons are compliant with the regulations of the Shaw Act, perhaps at a concessionary rate, please work perhaps with the Small Business Association and ensure that those small contractors can get on board in terms of compliance as well. As I said, small contractors in Barbados do not work on large prefab buildings, and they do not have the resources as some other entities may have to make these amendments in one fell swoop, to make these changes in one fell swoop. But I urge, Mr. President, I urge there to be some collaboration between the private sector associations in Barbados, perhaps the Small Business Association, to work with the financial sector in Barbados and to ensure that there are funds particularly dedicated to the recognition and compliance with these regulations here, Mr. President. So, Mr. President, I want to again make a very short reiteration that I am in full support of the amendments, and I want to ensure that we understand as senators that bills, as Senator King has said, does not necessarily create a static environment, one within which we put the bill there and it is never looked at again. But we can build the plane as we are laying it today, and we can continue to fly the plane based on your inputs and feedback. Based on their inputs and feedback, Mr. President, my apology. Just to let them know that we are willing and receptive as a government to take on the many notes that you've made. And with those few words, Mr. President, I am obliged. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Herod. Senator Cummings.
Thank you, Mr. President. I beg to move that the sitting of the Senate now be suspended until 2:35, 1 hour.
The question is that this sitting be suspended until 2:35 p.m. today. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Honourable senators against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This sitting is accordingly so suspended.